Welcome, deep divers. Today, we're not just looking back at history. We're stepping into a time of really profound global upheaval, a time where borders were violently redrawn. And for millions, the end of World War II brought not the promised peace, but a terrifying new chapter of loss and forced migration. Imagine, if you will, entire populations, families who had inhabited lands for centuries, suddenly deemed unreliable and uprooted. It's one of the most significant yet often deeply overlooked demographic shifts of the 20th century. Today we're diving deep into the expulsion of the German population from Czechoslovakia following World War II. It's an incredibly complex, often painful historical event, steeped in layers of political intent, profound societal trauma, and, well, unimaginable individual suffering. We'll be exploring a period where the very definition of nationhood was brutally redefined.
And our primary guide for this exploration is Theodor Schieder's comprehensive historical document, The Expulsion of the German Population from Czechoslovakia. What makes this source so valuable is its extensive compilation. It's not just, official legislation and government reports, but crucially, a multitude of personal testimonies and firsthand accounts. It truly provides a multifaceted perspective, allowing us to grasp the larger geopolitical forces at play while simultaneously understanding the intimate, often devastating human experience of those caught in their wake.
You've hit on something vital there. Our mission, as always, is to navigate these detailed sources, extracting the most important insights into the motivations, the precise mechanisms, and the profound human impact of this mass expulsion. We want to equip you with a nuanced understanding, complete with surprising facts and poignant details so you can quickly grasp the full scope of what happened and, perhaps more importantly, why it continues to resonate. Let's really dig into this. To truly comprehend the motivations behind these expulsions, we first have to go back, way back, really, to the very origins of the Czechoslovak state itself, and specifically the pre-war German presence within its borders. What was the understanding of nationhood at its founding?
That's where we uncover a foundational tension, yeah. When Czechoslovakia was created in 1918 and 1919, key figures like Edvard Beneš publicly articulated a vision of a new Switzerland. Now, for many, this implied a federated, multinational state, a mosaic where various ethnic groups, including Germans, would coexist peacefully and with equal rights. But here's the critical insight. This vision was, in large part, never truly realized.
Okay, so it was more of an ideal than a reality from the start.
Pretty much. Almost from the outset, the dominant Czech nation firmly maintained the principle of Czechoslovakia as their national state, a state primarily for Czechs and Slovaks. This fundamental conceptual difference, a national state versus a multinational state, immediately set the stage for future conflicts and created an inherent hierarchy.
Right.
It effectively classified Germans, particularly the Sudeten Germans, as, at best, a tolerated minority rather than equal co-founders with a true stake in the nation's identity.
Tolerated. That's a key word.
It is, and it's telling that the Sudeten Germans were not even invited to participate in the Republic's creation. Indeed, they initially resisted the very idea of joining. This early exclusion was a powerful sign of things to come.
So from the very beginning, there was this intrinsic tension, a sense of us versus them, woven into the very fabric of the state's identity. But the German population itself wasn't a monolithic entity, was it? They weren't all living in one concentrated area, like neatly packed together.
Oh, far from it. No. The geographical and demographic realities further complicated this nascent national identity. In Bohemia and Moravia, the Sudeten territory formed a widely stretched belt, mostly contiguous with the German linguistic area. If you look at a map, you'd see a distinct, almost continuous German-speaking region bordering Germany and Austria, representing a significant portion of Czechoslovakia's population, millions, in fact.
Right, the Sudetenland we often hear about.
Exactly. However, in Slovakia, the German population was much more dispersed. They often lived in linguistic islands, these sort of pockets where German speakers lived intermingled with Slovak communities.
Ah, okay, different setup entirely.
Yeah, think of areas like the Zips, Hauerland, and the Pressburg region. These house smaller, often more isolated German communities. For instance, the 1930 census recorded 154,821 Germans in Slovakia, with 147,501 of them holding Czechoslovak citizenship. While a significant number, this was markedly different from the larger, more concentrated German populations in Bohemia and Moravia Silesia.
So that spatial distribution alone would mean vastly different local experiences, different political leverage, I imagine.
Absolutely. It's a crucial distinction.
So the experiences of these Slovakian Germans would have been quite distinct from their Sudeten German counterparts in Bohemia and Moravia. Can you elaborate on the unique pressures they faced?
Definitely. While linked to the overall German population by language and heritage, Germans in Slovakia faced unique historical pressures. Up to 1918, during the Austro-Hungarian era, many experienced widespread Magyarization.
Magyarization. What exactly did that involve?
It was a deliberate policy by the Hungarian government to assimilate non-Magyar populations into Hungarian culture and language. It particularly targeted the intelligentsia and middle classes. So their German national consciousness was often suppressed.
Pushed down.
Exactly. Post-World War I, however, their German national consciousness was ironically strengthened. This often came with assistance from Sudeten Germans, an influx of teachers, the establishment of German cultural associations, cooperative movements expanded, all aimed at bolstering German cultural identity in Slovakia.
Interesting. So help from the other German groups actually boosted their identity after the pressure was supposedly off.
In a way, yes. But here's where it gets truly interesting. Despite these efforts to strengthen German identity, there were complex, often layered loyalties at play. The source details, for example, that the German inhabitants of Kremnitz actually demanded that their Magyar school be retained rather than having a German elementary school opened.
Wait, really? They wanted the Hungarian school. Why?
Well, it wasn't necessarily a rejection of German identity. It could have been practical considerations or maybe a reflection of long-standing local integration, It illustrates how individuals and communities often had multifaceted identities and allegiances that didn't always align neatly with burgeoning nationalistic categories.
That makes sense. Real life is messy, not just neat boxes.
Exactly, making a blanket policy of German identity overly simplistic.
This pre-war context really highlights that the groundwork for tensions was already laid. Moving from that, it becomes undeniably clear that the expulsion wasn't just a spontaneous emotional reaction to the atrocities of World War II. There was a considerable amount of premeditated planning and ideological groundwork laid for it, often by the government in exile.
What's fascinating here is how early and systematically this planning began. Czechoslovak politicians in exile in London, particularly during the war, were already making explicit preparations for the expulsion. They framed it not just as punishment for the Sudeten Germans, whom they largely blamed collectively for the Munich Agreement and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia.
Collective blame idea again.
Right, but also as a final solution of the minority problem. That phrase itself is incredibly loaded, given the contemporary context.
Chillingly so.
Yeah. Figures like Deputy Prime Minister Hubert Ripke openly justified this demand by stating that Sudeten Germans shared guilt for the loss of national freedom, essentially applying a blanket collective guilt. This demonstrates that the concept of expulsion was not merely a spontaneous emotional reaction to wartime suffering, but a deliberate, premeditated policy, meticulously framed as both a just retribution and a permanent surgical solution to perceived ethnic issues that had plagued the First Republic. It was a conscious choice, not merely a knee-jerk reaction.
And this wasn't just abstract discussion among politicians in London. This planning quickly translated into concrete, detailed proposals. Most notably, President Edvard Beneš's 10-point plan in 1944. This sounds like it was a comprehensive blueprint for exclusion.
It absolutely was. Beneš's directive laid down the principle that going forward, all Germans in Czechoslovakia would be considered citizens of the German Reich.
Wow, just like that, stripped of citizenship.
En masse, effectively. It then went on to outline specific categories for immediate expulsion. This included Gestapo members, SS formations, German police, officials appointed after the Munich Agreement of 1938, or after the German occupation in March 1939, and prominent Heinlein functionaries.
Heinlein, he was the Sudeten German party leader, right?
Yeah.
The one pushing for annexation.
That's him. So these functionaries were seen as direct collaborators. These were the first waves targeted to go, based on direct involvement with the Nazi regime or collaboration. But here's where it gets really interesting and have profound geopolitical implications. Beneš specifically sought and received enthusiastic Soviet support for these plans.
Soviet support, how did that come about?
Well, when Beneš, during a visit to Moscow, proposed to Molotov, the formidable Soviet foreign minister at the time, the transfer of millions of Sudeten Germans, Molotov reportedly reacted with, "That's a trifle, that's easy."
A trifle. Millions of people.
Apparently so. And Stalin himself, according to accounts, even went further. He took Beneš to a map in the Kremlin and marked new German frontiers with a red pencil, seemingly sketching out the post-war landscape right there.
Incredible. That's quite a green light.
It was decisive. This early and unambiguous Soviet backing profoundly influenced Czechoslovakia's post-war alignment and internal policies. It essentially gave Beneš's government immense political capital and a powerful okay to implement these radical policies without significant international opposition from the East. It effectively insulated them from Soviet criticism and, in many respects, from the broader Allied Control Council, too.
That kind of external backing, a carte blanche from a powerful ally, would have made the internal decision-making much more decisive and, well, pretty much unstoppable, wouldn't it?
Exactly.
And it really set the stage for a fundamental reshaping of the nation's identity, a refounding based on entirely new principles.
Precisely. The government's proclamation of May 11, 1945, made this explicit and unambiguous for everyone to hear. It declared, "The new republic will be a Slav state, the Republic of Czechs and Slovaks. The Germans and Magyars who have committed such bad crimes will be regarded as having lost their citizenship, and we shall punish them severely."
That's a Slav state, explicitly.
Explicitly. This declaration wasn't just rhetoric. It fundamentally redefined the state's identity, moving away from any pretense of multinationalism towards a singular, ethnically defined Slav state. It legally and ideologically paved the way for the swift and comprehensive exclusion of non-Slav populations and provided a robust justification for the punitive measures that followed, all based on a sweeping notion of collective guilt.
So it wasn't merely a political shift, it was a radical ideological transformation of the very concept of nationhood within Czechoslovakia.
That's a good way to put it.
So, with the war ending, this ideology and these blueprints quickly translated into brutal action on the ground. The immediate aftermath of the war, particularly the spring and summer of 1945, was a period of intense chaos and what tragically became known as wild expulsions. Can you walk us through the initial moments, especially the Prague uprising?
Indeed. The Czech rising against German rule began in Prague on May 5, 1945. It was a spontaneous uprising that quickly escalated into systematic persecution of Germans. The city was gripped by a powerful desire for liberation and, frankly, retribution. German signs were immediately removed from shops, streets, public buildings.
Just erased.
Pretty much. Replaced by flags with Czech and Allied colors appearing everywhere. German patrols and individual soldiers, often those trying to surrender or escape, were disarmed and frequently killed if they tried to defend themselves. Interestingly, false rumors that American troops were already near Prague contributed to the premature outbreak of the uprising.
Oh, really? So it kicked off earlier than planned?
Yeah, somewhat against the intentions of the National Council, which had plans for a later, more organized revolt. This highlights the volatile, often uncontrollable atmosphere on the ground. Minister of State K.H. Frank, a high-ranking Nazi official, had ordered preparations for the evacuation of Germans into the Bohemian forest, a desperate project that revealed the illusions some Nazi politicians still held.
A bit delusional by then.
You could say that, but for the Germans in Prague, there was no escape.
And then, just days later, the Red Army entered Prague. That would only have amplified the chaos, and for many Germans, shifted one terror for another, I suppose.
That's right. Soviet troops officially occupied Prague on May 9, and their arrival unfortunately brought with it a short phase of widespread excesses. These were often driven by direct exhortations of personal revenge and retribution that had been issued by Soviet soldiers' newspapers and broadcasts to the Red Army throughout the war.
Revenge explicitly encouraged.
Yes, urging them to avenge the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Reports from this period mention shattering personal experiences, almost leading to suicide psychosis among the German population due to these events. Soviet soldiers frequently engaged in widespread looting, particularly targeting German homes and businesses, and tragically, a wave of rapes.
Horrifying.
What's particularly grim is that Czech guards in newly established internment camps sometimes actively encouraged, or at the very least allowed, these intrusions, doing little to prevent Red Army soldiers from carrying out their excesses against German women and girls, viewing them as part of the collective enemy.
That paints a really bleak picture of a total breakdown of order and basic human rights. The term wild action seems to perfectly capture the sheer brutality and unorganized violence of this immediate post-war period. Can you give us a more vivid sense of what that looked like on the ground?
It does, tragically. This period was characterized by widespread wild actions, meaning unofficial, often vigilante-style violence, including mass murders, arbitrary internment, and forced marches. The purge of Prague from the Germans began almost immediately after the uprising, with mass internments and forced labor for anyone identified as German. We see horrifying examples like the mass murder of the male population of Glaserhau by a partisan detachment on 21 September 1944 in Slovakia.
That was even before the war ended.
Yes, which highlights the pre-existing animosity. But perhaps the most infamous event, and one that is still deeply etched in historical memory, was the Brno Death March.
The Brno Death March. I've heard of that. What happened there?
On May 30th, 1945, with virtually no warning, approximately 25,000 ethnic Germans from Brno men, women, children, the elderly, were rounded up. They were forcibly marched 55 kilometers towards the Austrian border. The stated rationale was a unilateral order from the Czech authorities in Brno to purge the city.
25,000 people just marched out.
Yes. Imagine thousands of people, stripped of most of their possessions, forced to walk for days with little food or water, often under the constant threat of violence from the accompanying guards. The conditions were absolutely horrific. Reports from survivors detail how those who collapsed from exhaustion, illness, or age were often beaten, left behind, or even shot.
Oh my God.
A typhus epidemic quickly broke out among the weakened population, and accounts confirm that at least 100 a day were dying, their bodies often left by the roadside.
Unbelievable cruelty.
These early, often unorganized expulsions highlight the immediate violent nature of the post-war retribution, frequently fueled by deep-seated hatred and a raw desire for revenge.
So we've heard harrowing accounts of the wild expulsions and Red Army excesses. It paints a picture of near universal brutality. But was this the experience for all Germans everywhere? Were there any pockets where the arrival of Allied forces brought a different kind of reality?
That's a crucial question, and it highlights a stark, almost unbelievable contrast in the narrative. The fate of German populations was profoundly influenced by which Allied power arrived first.
So it mattered who got there first.
Immensely. Where American troops occupied German localities, the occupation was not accompanied by looting, rape, and other forms of violence. This provides a crucial point of comparison, underscoring that the brutality experienced in Red Army-occupied or Czech-controlled areas was not universally inevitable.
Right, it was a consequence of specific conditions and behavior.
Exactly. In American-held areas, mayors were often temporarily left in office, or respected local citizens were appointed as provisional leaders. While American authorities did demand the surrender of arms and imposed curfews, standard occupational procedures, they also explicitly protected German families with clean political records from Czech terror.
So some protection, at least temporarily.
For a time, yes. Some German communities found themselves under a different, far less violent form of occupation. A stark reminder of how contingent individual survival could be on the lines drawn on a map by advancing armies.
The initial chaos and wild actions, while horrific, eventually began to give way to a more formalized, though no less severe process. This period saw the establishment of a sophisticated legal framework that underpinned this widespread exclusion and expropriation. How did the Czechoslovak government legitimize these actions?
The transition from intent to action was swift and decisive. Immediately after the war's end, a torrent of presidential decrees, issued rapidly in June and July 1945, began to reshape the legal landscape. They provided the seemingly legitimate backbone for what would become a massive undertaking of exclusion and expropriation.
So giving it a legal veneer.
Precisely. These weren't just punitive measures, they were fundamentally transformative, designed to remake the nation. Key decrees included one concerning the punishment of Nazi criminals, traitors, and their accomplices, and the Extraordinary People's Courts. This established a legal mechanism for collective punishment. Then, crucially, came the decree concerning the confiscation and speedy distribution of agricultural property of Germans, Magyars, and also of traitors and enemies of the Czech and Slovak people.
Confiscation and redistribution.
Okay. And another important one was the proclamation of the Ministry of Finance concerning the safeguarding of German property, which effectively froze their assets. Quickly followed by a decree concerning the colonization of the agricultural land of Germans, Magyars, and other enemies of the state by Czech, Slovak, and other Slav farmers.
So taking the land and giving it to others, it's incredibly systematic.
Yes. These decrees established comprehensive legal grounds for both broad-scale punishment and the systematic redistribution of property, effectively dismantling the economic foundation of the German population.
So it wasn't just about removing people. It was about fundamentally restructuring the economy and property ownership. These decrees sound incredibly far-reaching. What was the ultimate aim beyond simply punishing those deemed enemies? Was there a larger economic or social transformation at play?
Absolutely. It went far beyond mere punishment. These decrees ordered complete expropriation without compensation of all property belonging to individuals of German and Magyar nationality.
No compensation at all.
None. This policy was deeply intertwined with a broader program of nationalization and socialist aims, heavily influenced by the Kaschau Program.
The Kaschau Program. Remind us what that was again.
Sure. It was adopted by the Czechoslovak government in April 1945, essentially the blueprint for the post-war state. It not only outlined the policy of expelling Germans and Magyars, but also mandated extensive nationalization of key industries and land reform. It laid the foundation for a more socialist economy and aligning Czechoslovakia's future with the Soviet sphere.
Okay, so the expulsion and the move towards socialism were linked.
Very closely. For the communists, in particular, who were rapidly gaining influence, the expropriation of Germans wasn't just about retribution. It was a strategic, foundational step towards transforming Czechoslovakia into a socialist economy. It was, as some historians describe, a pacemaker for communism.
A pacemaker for communism. That's a striking phrase.
It is. By stripping Germans of their assets, the state acquired a vast pool of resources. Factories, farms, homes, businesses that could then be redistributed, nationalized, or used to solidify communist economic control. All payments to Germans were to be made into blocked accounts, which they could not access.
So their money was effectively useless to them.
Pretty much. And they were required to deposit all valuables, precious metals, art, everything. Furthermore, when the Reichsmark ceased to be legal currency, it was exchanged at a punitive 1-to-10 rate against the Czech crown, with only a small, almost symbolic limit of 300 crowns.
Just crushing them economically before they even left.
Absolutely. This economic exclusion was comprehensive, reducing Germans to destitution and simultaneously empowering the new socialist-leaning state. An article from the time, with the title translating to something like, "The need for a thorough cleaning out in our frontier districts, we must have a new broom." It starkly illustrates how national administrators appointed to manage this confiscated property were often unqualified marauders, primarily seeking material advantages.
So corruption was rife amidst all this.
It seems so, yes.
Yeah.
Highlighting the pervasive corruption amidst this large-scale economic upheaval.
The dehumanization didn't stop at economic measures. It extended into the very fabric of daily life, systematically stripping Germans of basic rights and dignity, marking them physically as outcasts.
That's right. Germans faced severe, widespread discrimination that permeated every aspect of their existence. They were forbidden from using public transport, visiting public entertainment venues, even entering parks, essentially confining them to their homes or immediate neighborhoods.
Cut off from public life.
Completely. Strict curfews were imposed, making any movement after dark risky. Specific, limited shopping hours were designated for them, typically only 1 hour before closing time.
Ensuring they got the leftovers, I suppose.
Exactly. Ensuring they had access only to leftover or less desirable goods. A particularly humiliating measure, detailed in a proclamation from Bomisch-Lippe in June 45, required all Germans over 6 years of age to wear a white disc, 15 centimeters in diameter, with a prominent black N stitched onto their left breast. For former Nazi Party members, an additional disc was mandated on their back.
A physical mark, like the yellow star for Jews under the Nazis.
The parallels are disturbing, yes. They were also required to remove their hats and maintain a respectful distance when encountering Russian or Czech officers. These measures were explicitly designed to dehumanize and isolate the German population, stripping them of social standing and basic liberties, marking them publicly as outcasts.
Enemies within their own communities. The psychological toll of such public shaming must have been immense.
Unimaginable.
With the legal groundwork laid and social exclusion institutionalized, many Germans found themselves not just stripped of property and rights, but rounded up into internment camps or compelled into forced labor. This must have been a truly widespread and horrific ordeal, a systematic process that touched almost every German family.
It was indeed a widespread and profoundly traumatic ordeal. Germans were systematically rounded up and confined in numerous internment camps across Czechoslovakia. We see names emerge repeatedly from the historical accounts. Duby near Kladno, Kalin, KT-28 near Brix, Spinnerai near Kazmark, Novaki, among many others. Conditions in these camps were universally grim, marked by severe overcrowding. Imagine, as one testimony describes, 30 human beings in a space of some 25 square meters.
Of 3 people. It's impossible.
Basic hygiene was virtually non-existent, leading to primitive sanitary arrangements that caused mass cases of dysentery and other stomach and intestinal illnesses to sweep through the populations. Food was scarce and woefully inadequate, typically half a liter thin potato soup without any salt, 200 grams of bread, and twice daily some bitter black coffee.
Starvation rations, basically.
Pretty much. The cumulative effect was widespread emaciation and disease. A shocking testimony from Duby Camp quotes a commandant stating, with chilling clarity, "For us, the Germans are no human beings and they are treated accordingly."
No human beings. That says it all, doesn't it?
It encapsulates the deliberate, state-sanctioned dehumanization that permeated these institutions.
That's horrifying. And the abuse wasn't just neglect and starvation. It was often direct, brutal, and violent. The testimonies from this period speak of immense physical and psychological suffering.
Sadly, yes. Physical and psychological abuse was rampant and systematic. Beatings, torture, and sexual violence were common occurrences, frequently perpetrated by Red Army soldiers who intruded into camps, often unhindered and sometimes even encouraged by Czech guards, or by the Czech guards themselves.
So, guards facilitating abuse.
The reports suggest that, yes, deaths from emaciation, disease, severe beatings, and summary executions were frequent. The source material is filled with agonizing details. Reports describe women having her hair cut off with large scissors, red paint poured over their heads as a mark of shame.
Humiliation piled on top of everything else.
Exactly. Women having 4 teeth knocked out, rings torn by force from our swollen fingers, by guards or looters. Old men attempting to protect women or children were simply knocked down. The Trek Koenig report vividly recounts a night filled with the salvos of rifles and machine guns, with the pitiful shouts for help and the piercing screams of women who were being raped.
It's hard to even process that level of brutality.
It paints a grim picture of systematic brutality, reflecting a complete breakdown of human rights for the intern population, where individuals were stripped of all protection and subjected to the arbitrary cruelty of their captors.
It sounds like there was no escape from this system, even through compulsory labor. For many, it seems the camps were just a prelude to or intertwined with forced work.
That's correct. Compulsory labor was enacted for all German men up to 60 and women up to 45 who had lost Czechoslovak citizenship. Release from the system was nearly impossible, granted only for complete inability to go on working, usually due to severe illness or injury that rendered them totally unproductive.
So you worked until you literally couldn't anymore.
Essentially, yes. German forced laborers endured harsh conditions in industrial areas like Marsch Ostrau and Kladno, working in mines and factories and on numerous farms across the country. Children were not exempt from abuse either, often being verbally abused, spat upon, and pelted with stones as they accompanied their parents or were sent out to work.
Even the children weren't spared.
No. In a particularly cruel instance highlighting the deliberate denial of basic necessities, reports indicate that vegetables and fruit were sometimes left to rot in fields rather than be given to Germans, with one administrator explicitly stating, with chilling contempt, "We'd rather give it to the pigs than to the Germans."
That's just pure malice.
It underscores the profound economic and social impact as Germans were reduced to forced labor, and their access to basic necessities was deliberately denied, not out of scarcity, but out of a pervasive sense of contempt and a desire to ensure their destitution. It was a dual strategy of punishment and economic exploitation.
And beyond the physical and economic hardship, there was a systematic and deliberate effort to erase German culture and identity from Czechoslovakia, to make their presence as if it had never been.
Absolutely. The suppression of German culture and religion was a key, often overlooked component of this broader policy of erasure. German schools were systematically closed, and German children were explicitly excluded from attending Czech schools,
Denying them education entirely.
effectively denying them any formal education in either their native tongue or the new national language. German inscriptions, even those on ancient tombstones, were removed.
Wiping away the history from the landscape itself.
Yes, as part of a broader physical effort to erase their historical presence, German church property was confiscated, and German clergy were frequently obstructed from performing their duties or, in many cases, interned alongside their congregations. A pastor, for instance, recounted being denied permission to hold religious services in a camp even at Christmas, and was explicitly told by a guard, "For us, the Germans are no human beings."
That phrase again, chilling.
German books, prayer books, and Bibles were also systematically confiscated. This demonstrates a deliberate attempt not just to expel a population, but to systematically erase their cultural, linguistic, and religious presence from the country, striving for a complete national redefinition where German heritage had no place. It was a cultural ethnic cleansing alongside the physical one.
So we've covered the initial violent chaos and the legal framework that quickly institutionalized the persecution. Eventually, the wild expulsions were supposed to give way to something more organized, leading to the internationally sanctioned Odsen following the Potsdam Agreement. This must have given the Czech government enormous leverage.
Yes, the Potsdam Agreement, specifically Article 13, provided a crucial international mandate. It sanctioned the transfer to Germany of German populations, remaining in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. The Czechoslovak government received with gratitude this decision, viewing it as the ultimate international legitimacy for their long-held policy.
So they saw it as justification.
Absolutely. However, they were worried by the postponement of the transfer and urged its speedy execution, indicating their desire to accelerate an already underway process. This is a vital insight. While Potsdam provided the international mandate, the Czech government interpreted it as a firm green light to continue and accelerate expulsions, driven by their existing internal agenda. Ripke, the deputy prime minister, for instance, in a broadcast, explicitly stated that the expulsion of Germans was among the principal measures for the safeguarding of European peace.
Wow. Framing expulsion as peacekeeping.
The international community, weary from war, effectively gave its blessing to a massive population displacement.
But despite this international sanction, there were significant challenges and ongoing negotiations, especially regarding the uncontrolled and often brutal nature of the early wild expulsions. The Allies weren't entirely comfortable with the chaos, were they?
No, they certainly weren't. Allied powers repeatedly requested Czechoslovakia to stop wild removals until more organized and humane transfers could be arranged. The Allied Control Council in Germany, at the beginning of October 1945, again requested to discontinue their removals, which was agreed to by the Czechoslovak government.
So they agreed, but did they actually stop?
Well, despite these agreements and pledges, historical accounts confirm that repeated expulsions had taken place in disregard of the Potsdam regulations. This highlights a persistent tension between the international community's desire for orderly transfers and Czechoslovakia's internal drive to remove Germans as quickly as possible, often overriding humanitarian concerns.
The internal pressure was stronger.
It seems so. Negotiations between U.S. and Czech authorities in early 1946 then established more specific procedures for transfers to the American zone, attempting to bring some semblance of order. Even Beneš himself, in an October 1945 speech, acknowledged international criticism regarding the undignified and inadmissible manner of the transfers, but categorically stated, revealing the uncompromising resolve: our Germans must go away into the Reich, and they will go in any case.
They will go in any case. No ambiguity there.
None. The wheels were already in motion, and nothing would stop them.
So once the organized transfers, the Odsen, officially began, what did the logistics look like on the ground? It must have been an enormous undertaking to move millions of people.
It was an immense logistical challenge, often fraught with human suffering. The organized transports, commonly referred to as Odsen, typically involved rail or, less frequently, water transport. Agreements between the Allied and Czechoslovak authorities specified details like daily refugee trains, carefully regulated luggage limits. Initially, 50 kilograms per person for the U.S. zone, later tragically reduced to a mere 30 kilograms, plus a small provision of 7 days of non-perishable food.
30 kilograms. That's
Right.
barely anything to start a new life with.
Practically nothing. Medical checks were theoretically supposed to ensure that only healthy individuals were transported initially, aiming to avoid those who were pregnant or had infectious diseases. However, the reality on the ground was often very different from the meticulous planning. For example, a grim report from a train leaving Freudenthal for Augsburg noted only 50 men fit for work among 595 persons.
Mostly not working-age men then.
Exactly. Another from Marienbad to Würzburg had 70 men among 12,295. This reveals a population largely consisting of the vulnerable women, children, the elderly, the sick. Families were officially supposed not to be separated, but this was frequently violated in the chaos of departure.
So families were broken up during the process too.
Often, yes. And perhaps most devastatingly, luggage, often the last vestiges of their former lives, was routinely looted or confiscated at various checkpoints. One poignant testimony states, with a profound sense of loss, Nothing much was left after this of our 30 kilograms of luggage, because underwear, clothes, even children's shoes, anything that was new or of good quality was taken away.
Taking even children's shoes, it's systematic dispossession.
These were not simply logistic movements, they were forced migrations that systematically stripped people of their remaining dignity and possessions.
And where were these expellees ultimately sent? Were their destinations always what they hoped for, or did this process add another layer of disillusionment?
Oh, far from it. This process added another significant layer of trauma and disillusionment. Expellees were directed to various zones of occupied Germany, American, British, or Soviet. Many harbored desperate hopes of reaching the Western zones, often due to perceived better conditions, the presence of relatives, or a belief that they would find more stability and a chance to rebuild.
Understandable hopes.
Absolutely. Their disappointment was often great when they found that their train was being directed into the Soviet zone, a destination many viewed with profound apprehension. Reports from the Soviet zone described factories being dismantled continuously for reparations, continuing rapes were committed, and widespread hunger prevailed.
So potentially jumping from the frying pan into the fire.
Creating conditions that many felt were similar to, or in some cases even worse than, what they were fleeing in Czechoslovakia. This added another layer of trauma to an already arduous journey, as their hopes for a new, stable beginning were frequently dashed upon arrival, forcing them to confront yet another harsh reality. The arbitrary nature of their destination meant that, even at the end of their forced journey, their fate remained largely out of their control.
We've talked about these broad, sweeping policies that affected millions. But what about Germans who were arguably loyal to Czechoslovakia, or those who had actively opposed the Nazis? Were there any exemptions, any special cases, or was the net cast so wide that almost no one could escape?
This is a crucial and often tragic aspect of the story, highlighting the devastating impact of collective guilt. While Beneš and others did make provisos for loyal Germans, particularly those persecuted by the Nazis, such as communists, social democrats, or German Jews, the reality on the ground was often very different.
So the promises didn't always hold up.
They frequently undermined any promise of exception. The broad decree of August 2nd, 1945, unequivocally deprived all who declared German nationality of Czechoslovak citizenship, regardless of their individual history.
All. Even proven anti-Nazis.
That's what the decree implied. This meant that the exception was frequently undermined by the prevailing atmosphere of collective guilt and the expansive, often arbitrary definition of German nationality. It made it incredibly difficult for even proven anti-Nazis or German Jews to escape the general measures. An article in Lidový Večerní, a prominent newspaper, clarified the official stance with chilling precision. If a Jew declared German nationality, he must proceed in the same way as any other citizen of German nationality.
That's perverse logic.
Yeah.
Punishing victims of Nazism alongside perpetrators.
Exactly. Reports explicitly state, even German Jews and anti-Nazis recently released from Gestapo concentration camps are not immune. This demonstrates how the desire for a homogeneous state overshadowed individual circumstances, leading to the persecution of those who had themselves been victims of the very regime the Czechs were fighting.
So even with something like an Antifa pass for anti-fascist, which sounds like it should have offered protection, the reality seemed to be quite limited and often politically manipulated.
Indeed. The Antifa pass, signifying anti-fascist, was ostensibly meant to be a protective document for those who had actively resisted Nazism or were victims of its persecution. Initially, the Ministry of the Interior extended this protection to those who had been in German concentration camps for political or racial reasons, or who could prove their active support against Nazism, or even individuals deemed indispensable to the state.
Okay, so there was a mechanism, in theory.
In theory. However, the practical application of this was often severely limited and politically manipulated, especially as communist influence grew. For example, organizations like Organisation Ulmen, which valiantly tried to secure emigration for social democrats, faced significant difficulties from communist-dominated authorities. While some 30,000 communists reached central Germany with preferential treatment, the proportion of social democrats allowed to emigrate was far less.
Despite their anti-Nazi credentials.
Despite their greater pre-war membership numbers and undeniable anti-Nazi stance, this highlights how political expediency often overrode genuine anti-fascist credentials. The system was, in many cases, used to favor specific political groups who aligned with the new government's ideology, rather than serving as a universal shield for all anti-Nazis.
And what about those whose property had been seized? Especially Jewish properties, which often represented generational wealth and a deeply rooted presence. Was there any chance of restitution, of reclaiming what was unjustly taken?
The struggle for restitution, particularly for Jewish properties, became nearly impossible, adding another layer of injustice. This was largely due to the broader nationalization policies of the post-war government, deeply embedded in the Kaschau Program and the drive towards a socialist economy.
So the socialist agenda trumped restitution claims.
It seems so. Claims for restitution were frequently refused, often with the spurious accusation that the claimants had supported Germanization regardless of their actual history or suffering under Nazi rule. This demonstrates how the broader political and economic goals of the post-war government often overshadowed and effectively nullified any specific promises or exceptions. It led to widespread and irreversible loss for all Germans, regardless of their political past or individual circumstances, often compounding the trauma already endured by Jewish victims.
Another layer of loss for Holocaust survivors.
Tragically, yes. The systematic confiscation of property was a profound and lasting blow, cementing the economic transformation and making return virtually impossible.
Behind all the decrees, the plans, and the organized transfers, there are millions of individual human stories. The human cost of these expulsions is immense, marked by personal anguish and profound trauma that resonated for decades. We need to remember that these were not just statistics, but lives.
The reports and testimonies collected in Schieder's work are truly harrowing, painting a vivid picture of this suffering. Many describe arduous, brutal journeys that beggar belief. Families were routinely separated, often without warning, with men frequently sent to forced labor camps, while women, children, and the elderly were expelled separately, sometimes without knowing when or if they would ever reunite.
The uncertainty must have been agonizing.
One woman's account vividly describes being forced to walk for 40 kilometers, her children crying from exhaustion, one collapsing, the pace brutally accelerated by shots and the cracking of whips from the guards.
Just horrific cruelty.
Another tells of wandering for 10 days along dusty roads, then, with 2,000 others, being forced to cross the Neisse River into the Soviet zone, utterly dispossessed and uncertain of their fate. These were not just statistical movements of populations, they were deeply traumatic, forced migrations that broke families, destroyed communities, and etched indelible scars onto the survivors.
The sheer physical endurance required, combined with the psychological terror, is almost unimaginable. And the impact went far beyond the immediate physical hardships of the journey itself. The psychological scars, the loss of identity, and the profound sense of dislocation must have been immense and long-lasting.
The enduring memories of loss and humiliation weigh heavily in these accounts, revealing the immense psychological impact. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological trauma was profound. The systematic looting of homes, the public humiliation through forced markings and restrictions, the constant threat of violence, and the utter loss of home, community, and identity left deep generational scars.
Scars passed down through families.
Yes. Many describe feeling utterly lost, arriving in a foreign land where they cannot see a single familiar face anywhere, and everybody spoke in a terribly alien-sounding language. The constant uncertainty and fear led to nerves at breaking point, pushing many to the brink of despair. Eyewitnesses spoke of the frighteningly rapid spread of moral decay within internment camps, where desperation bred a breakdown of social norms.
A breakdown of humanity itself, almost.
The unforgettable sight, especially of the many women with babies and very small children who had to share this terrible fate, became a recurring image in their nightmares. These accounts highlight a systematic erosion of dignity and mental well-being, a complete shattering of their world.
It's easy, and perhaps natural, to get lost in the sheer scale of the cruelty and the systemic nature of the violence. But even in the darkest moments, amidst all this widespread hatred, there were individual instances of humanity. These small acts often stand out in the testimonies.
This is an incredibly important detail amidst the overwhelming narrative of brutality, and it offers a crucial counterpoint to the idea of universal malevolence. Despite the widespread hatred and systemic cruelty, there were individual instances of humanity, often undertaken at great personal risk.
People risking themselves to help.
Yes. Some Czech guards or civilians acting independently offered protection, food, or assistance to Germans. For example, Rudolf Grinig's report tells of an old Russian worker who had worked for his family. Upon finding their house abandoned, he meticulously gathered their belongings into a pile but then vanished without looting, leaving their few possessions intact.
A small act of respect amidst chaos.
Exactly. Another account describes a Czech caretaker who secretly brought rolls and white bread to a German hospital where conditions were dire, showing compassion for the sick. And there's a poignant story of a Czech sergeant major who treated a German prisoner with unexpected kindness, sharing food and cigarettes during a journey, recognizing a fellow human being despite the prevailing animosity.
Those moments matter, don't they? They show that humanity wasn't completely extinguished.
They do. These moments, though rare and often overshadowed by the larger narrative of suffering, underscore the complexity of human behavior during extreme times. They offer a powerful counterpoint to the dominant story of cruelty and remind us that individual empathy could, and sometimes did, transcend nationalistic fervor and official directives, shining a small light in an otherwise dark chapter.
We've just navigated a truly harrowing period, examining the complex pre-war context, the meticulous political machinations of the exile government, the violent wild expulsions, the institutionalized legal framework of confiscation and discrimination, and the grim realities of internment and forced labor. We've heard echoes of personal suffering and survival, often against impossible odds, and even glimpsed moments of unexpected kindness.
What clearly emerges from our deep dive is a picture of a nation fundamentally reconfigured, not just geographically, but sociologically and politically. The expulsion of Germans wasn't just an ethnic cleansing. It inadvertently served as a pacemaker for communism in Czechoslovakia.
That phrase again. How did the expulsion act as a pacemaker?
Well, by eagerly participating in this policy of widespread expropriation and the radical redefinition of citizenship, non-communist forces within the Czech political landscape found themselves, well, kind of caught between the grinding gears of historical retribution and the advancing agenda of socialism. The communists, already well-organized and ideologically prepared, skillfully presented themselves as the true champions of national justice and the architects of this new Slav state.
They positioned themselves perfectly.
Exactly. By spearheading the confiscation of vast German property, everything from large factories to small farms and homes, they gained immense popular support. They could offer this massive pool of redistributed assets, from land to housing to Czechs and Slovaks, particularly the landless and the poor.
Creating a sense of gratitude and obligation.
Precisely. This created a profound sense of obligation and gratitude towards the communists, who were seen as the benefactors of this new order. Moreover, the systematic removal of a significant, often economically powerful ethnic group eliminated a potential source of non-communist opposition and further centralized economic control in the hands of the state.
Which aligned perfectly with socialist goals.
Perfectly. This didn't just shift borders, it profoundly shifted the internal political landscape for decades to come, solidifying the path towards communist dominance.
This deep dive into the expulsion of Germans from Czechoslovakia truly reveals the profound and devastating impact of collective guilt and nationalistic fervor when unleashed on a society. It forces us to ask, what happens to a society when the lines between individual responsibility and ethnic identity become so fundamentally blurred that an entire population is deemed guilty and stripped of their rights and homes? And how do we, as global citizens, learn from these histories where the liberation of one group is inextricably intertwined with the profound dispossession, suffering, and erasure of another?
Those are heavy questions.
They are. These are not just historical questions, but vital considerations for navigating our complex world today, and perhaps for understanding the echoes of such events that still reverberate globally.